to be now matched with what things are. Meaning, at any given moment, there are things in the environment or things that you are anticipating may happen in the future that are different from what you would want them to be. And those are the things that the brain focuses on, that what we notice, we talked a bit about finite resources last time, and we'll do more of that today. We can only notice so much. What we notice is largely dictated by what the brain is identifying as those kinds of problems. And when I use the word problem, that's what I mean, is there is something we're aware of or anticipating that may occur that is different than what we would want it to be. Doesn't matter how big or how small. That's a big part of the issue, I think, with this whole thing, is that people sometimes think something has to be a certain level of gravity or significance to count it as a problem before they're allowed to discuss it or talk about help. But the example I always use, because it's always true, is that as I talk, my mouth gets kind of dry, and I notice that sensation, and my brain translates that, perceives that as, oh, I need a drink of water, and I always have a glass of water here in front of me, and my brain instructs my arm and hands to pick it up and take a sip. I hope that doesn't sound gross on the recording. That was a problem. So accomplishment is when we resolve those problems, when we have an intention, something of which we are aware, we consciously and intentionally choose that we want, either in the very near term or almost an immediate sense, or somewhere down the line in the future. And then when we apply our efforts toward making that thing happen, and then reality does actually line up with what we intend it to be, what we want it to be, we have accomplished what we set out to accomplish. And the important thing about this is that it is a gap, and either end can move. So a lot of times people think of the accomplishment, what it is you are trying to do, as relatively static. That's the thing you need to do, and it's about getting yourself to do that thing. But that gap between what you want and what is can close on both ends, either by you doing things or really things happening outside of your efforts that make it so that what is comes closer to what you want. But also sometimes working on changing it so that what you want comes closer to what is. You know, setting the right goals and going for the right things is a big part of accomplishment. So here it is. Here's the big secret, accomplishment equation. It's super simple. There's other parts to it, but the base of it is this: cost is less than or equal to value. It's that simple. And it's a general rule of thumb, but as a general rule of thumb, consider that anything anyone ever does, they do because they believe that the cost of doing that thing, what it will take for them to do that thing, is less than or equal to the value of that thing, what they will get out of that thing. And we will talk in more detail about these terms. And the flip side is true as well, that when people don't do a thing, most of the time, or at least a lot of the time, it's because they don't believe that the value of that thing is greater than or equal to the cost of that thing. The exception to this, of course, is when there are things that we do actually believe the value is worth the cost, but we just can't afford to pay the cost anyway. There are lots of things that we think would be great if we could afford them, but we're out of resources. We don't have the time or energy or money or whatever resources it is that we need. And I talked some last week, so I'll only briefly touch on it, but our focus here is on utility, not accuracy. I'm never trying to take away from anything anybody else has established, especially anything that you found that helps you. But what we're focused on is finding things that are useful, that help us. So that's what this is for. It's fine for someone to say, well, you didn't accomplish it because you didn't care enough about it. That's fine, and it may be accurate, but it's not often useful. When we say those kinds of things to another person, or when we say those things to ourselves, it sometimes can create change and get us to accomplish whatever it is we're trying to do, in the moment or in the short term, but it's very rarely sustainable to have kind of that ineffable willpower, like I just gotta push through and force myself to get it done. So we want to be able to break things down in more detail so that we have more variables to tweak and make things easier to do, rather than, I always say executive functioning isn't about getting better at forcing yourself to do miserable things. It's about getting better at constructing your life so that the things that you need to do and want to do are the same thing as much as possible. And obviously it will never be 100%. So real briefly, because I don't know that we'll have time to go into the detail of all of these things, but I want to touch on how to break down cost and how to break down value a little bit. We'll start with value because that's where people mostly start to focus when there's an issue with accomplishing something. Value, my definition for that is how much we care about our beliefs, our guesses about the results of a thing happening or not happening or happening in a particular way versus another way. So if we're to focus on, we'll use writing an essay as our kind of through line example today, that the value of writing an essay comes in two pieces. There's the impact and there's the import. Impact is my belief about what will be different if the thing is done or not done or done in a specific way versus another way. What's the difference between those potential outcomes? And none of us can predict the future with accuracy 100%, but that's what we're doing all the time. We're collecting data from the moment, we're accessing data from our long-term memory and using our abstract reasoning, our intelligence to combine those things and look for patterns and make projections into the future. So we're all working on our best guesses. They will be wrong at least some of the time, probably a lot of the time, but that's what we've got to work with. So impact is our belief about what the difference in our lives, in the things of which we are aware, what the difference will be if a thing is done or not done, which we'll use as a shorthand for accomplishment, done or not done. Import is our subjective level of care, the meaning, the importance we put behind that impact. So again, for example, with this essay, if I believe that if I do this essay, I will get a better grade and that better grade will, increase my chances of getting into a better school and a better job and all that, but also my teacher will be happy with me, my parents will be happy with me, I'll be happy with myself, versus if I don't do it, then the grade is that much worse and decreases the chances of all those things happening, and I'm upset with myself and other people are upset with me, right? That's the impact. That's an observable thing. It's a guess about the future, but it is a thing that will happen, right? I might not be accurate about what will happen, but something will happen. The import is the subjective. Do I care about that or not, right? How much do I care about the difference in my likelihood of getting a good grade in a good college? Or how much do I care about the level to which, there will be a difference in how I and others around me perceive me because of accomplishing this essay or not? I'm starting here because people tend to start here when we are struggling or watching someone else struggle with doing something, that we come back to the value. We think that it's because people don't understand how important it is. Those phrases, they just don't care enough. I just don't care enough. They're lazy, which is one of my least favorite words in the world. They need to try harder. I just don't understand. I know they can do it, so why aren't they? They're not prioritizing properly, all these things, right? Well, we can change value, both for ourselves and for other people. We can change impact. We can change impact in two ways. One, we can change it by helping people to understand things that are more accurate than what they know or what they currently understand. So, for example, if I am not thinking of or not aware of the fact that me doing this essay does contribute to the likelihood of me getting into a college or getting a certain degree or career, it's all chances. But if I'm not connecting that, then someone can help me to connect that by explaining it to me. Like, by the way, just so you know, colleges look at your high school grades. So if you do this, your grade will be better and they'll like you more. So that can change the impact because it changes my belief of what will happen. The other thing we can do is we can actually, I call it manipulate value, but we can actually change the impact by arbitrarily and externally connecting things that are not intrinsically connected. Meaning, if I tell you that if you write the essay, I'm going to give you $100, well, now the impact has changed because in addition to all those things you were going to get from the essay, you now also get $100. And to whatever extent you care about that $100, the import, it is now that much more valuable for you to do this thing. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Yeah, Brandon, I think one of the questions in the chat that we're often so familiar with the terms internal versus external motivation. How did those two terms play into the accomplishment equation?
I like the conceptualization of internal and external motivation. I'm not so big on the word motivation itself, just because it's one of those words that, and we're actually going to do a whole episode on motivation next week. It's one of those words that gets used in many, many different ways. This conceptualization, I think, is a useful and valid one, but it gets so mixed up with people's preconceived notions about what motivation is. And in particular, we tend to use, well, I'm not going to go too much into detail about motivation because we'll do that next week. But yes, the problem with how people use internal versus external motivation, it is very similar to impact versus import, by the way, is that the question that I almost always get next after understanding internal versus external motivation is for someone to say, okay, so how do we create internal motivation? And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the concept is. The whole point is that we can't. We can create contexts and circumstances in which people can engage with things, new things, engage with old things differently that may occur, may result in them finding some attachment, some enjoyment in that thing. But there's nothing we can do to make somebody be internally motivated. That's the whole point. And so yes, in terms of this equation, what we're talking about is we can't really change somebody's import. We can't change the level to which somebody cares about a thing. We can change the impact, but not the import. And it is a very similar concept. We want to focus on observable as far as our perception, as opposed to, what it is that we do in that external motivation piece. When they talk about it, it's about what do we as the outside person do, what I would call manipulating value, right, in order to change that motivation piece. So I hit that over and over and over with people because it's banging your head against a brick wall to try and change how much someone cares about something. If you're not clarifying or manipulating the impact, there's not a lot to do in terms of value. But there is a whole nother side to this equation, and that's the point. This is what we want to emphasize, is that on the other side, there's cost, and there are many things that we can do to change the cost of a thing. And remember, it's the relative value. It's just that value needs to be equal to or higher than cost. So we can accomplish that by bringing value up or bringing cost down, or both. And generally speaking, just like internal and external motivation, manipulating value is a short-term solution. It works. Clarification can work long-term, can be sustainable, but actually manipulating the value by attaching rewards and punishments or whatever, it can work to get somebody to do something, but it doesn't make it any easier. And what the research shows is that that goes away. As soon as the people who are manipulating the value are no longer around or no longer have the energy and the vigilance to keep manipulating that value, then the behavior reverts right back to what it was. So in my work at Effective Artistry, when we're doing therapy or executive functioning coaching, we tend to focus on cost, not because it's a better thing to focus on than value necessarily, but just because it's the part that people tend not to look at as much. And then cost will break down. I'm playing with this language all the time. I'm trying to find like pithy ways. I'm trying to get the easiest way for people to be able to remember it. So I'll try some out on you guys tonight and you can tell me what you think. So cost equals criteria minus skill minus context. And we'll go through and define each of those terms. I keep playing with changing skill to competence because I want then it's 4 C words and that feels really nice for some reason, but it just doesn't quite click. You guys can weigh in. So cost we'll come back to in a second. Criteria, what we're talking about is the objective, the external, observable, measurable things that must be done in order to consider the task accomplished. So there are other factors, and that's what this whole thing is about, that make something different levels of difficult for each individual person. But for a task to be accomplished, there are certain things that need to be done. So if I'm going to say, I am going to fix my car, in order to consider that accomplished, well, the car has to, start when I turn the key and shift when I shift and go when I press the gas and stop when all those things. How difficult, how accessible, how easy that may be for me as an individual is going to vary based on a lot of other things, but that part of it stays the same. In order to call that fixed, it has to meet these criteria, right? And we'll talk about goal setting at some point, but probably not today, because intent and goal setting really is about how you define it. That's why I care so much about precision with words, right? We want to be real clear about what we're trying to do so that we know how to do it and we know how to recognize when we're done. So that's what we mean when we say criteria. Skill, what we're talking about is the accumulated knowledge and practices and experiences and abilities that we contain within us, that we have developed over time, that contribute to accomplishing this task. So in this fixing a car example, right? If I am a mechanic, if I have fixed many cars in the past, if I have, a working knowledge of how an engine works and what parts look like what and how to replace gaskets and whatever, it's going to be a lot easier. It's going to cost less for me to fix this car than it would for somebody else who has less skill, who has not already accrued the knowledge and the competencies and the practice. And then context is those things external to a person which contribute to or interfere with the accomplishment of a task. Context, it's important to note that there are positive contexts, there are negative contexts, and sometimes this is going to end up being an overall net negative. It's going to make it cost more to do the task. Sometimes it'll be easier. In this case, if I'm trying to fix a car and I run across a part that needs to be replaced that nobody makes anymore, that's context that's outside of me that's going to make it more difficult for me to fix the car. In fact, it might modify the cost so much to the point where I say it's no longer worth fixing this car. I'm not going to go like rebuild this, machine this part by hand, right? So I'm trying to be brief because I know I'm already going over my 15, 20 minutes here. So those three things combined dictate that cost. And when we talk cost, we're talking about resources. There are things that are finite resources that we have a limited amount of. And of those finite resources, any amount of each of them that we have to use in order to accomplish a thing, that's the cost, the resource cost. And there are four that I consider universal resources. They're used for every single task, even though a lot of the times it's negligible, insignificant amounts that's used for every task. One is time. No matter what it is that you're trying to do, you will be spending some amount of your time on it, if for no other reason than to set the intention or think about what you want to accomplish in the first place. One is energy, which is a little bit more subjective, but people, use different words for it, effort or motivation or willpower or whatever. But it's that sense of drive, that willingness, that ability, that pool of energy that you can draw on. And some of that, of course, is physical. We actually have, calories that give us physical energy, but some of it is more abstract than that. One is attention, and this is an important one that people overlook all the time. That attention is a finite resource, and for our purposes, we're defining attention as the amount of data per moment that you can bring into your awareness. There is, at any given moment, way more data that our sensory organs are picking up and that our internal cognition is generating. There's way more of that going on than we can fit into our awareness, which we'll talk about in a second. And so there is a process by which pre-consciously, without our conscious control or awareness, because in order to make a choice or be aware of it, we'd have to be aware of it. And this happens before we're aware of everything, right? That the brain and the nervous system uses to dictate which things come into awareness and which things are not worth bringing into that space. And we can do things to manipulate how our brain is prioritizing that, but we're not in control in the moment. So the example I always use is that until I say what I'm going to say 5 seconds from now, you're not consciously aware of the feeling of the chair underneath you or the floor or the bed or whatever it is that you're on underneath you. And as soon as I say that, you become aware that that sensory data, that your skin, the pressure, the texture that your skin was picking up and sending to the brain, it was always there. Those signals were always there. The brain just didn't deem it worth bringing into awareness and filtered it out. But as soon as I said those words, now all of a sudden the brain says, oh, this thing I'm focused on, these words connect to this experience. I better bring that data in because it seems relevant. So I feel pretty confident in saying that universally everybody that heard that sentence went from not being consciously aware of that to being consciously aware of that in just a split second. So attention is part of that. The other is, I keep using the word awareness. Another term you'll hear me use interchangeably with awareness is working memory. We talked about that as one of the executive functions. That working memory, the technical definition is that space in which we can hold information that we can manipulate. That long-term memory, we can put stuff in there, but it's frozen. In order to do anything with it, we have to retrieve it into working memory, into awareness. And that space is also finite. And it varies from person to person what types of data take what amount of space in that awareness, in that working memory. So those are universal, and we won't get into more because we're already pushing time, but some very common other resources: money, social capital, and then all kinds of task-specific resources. If I'm painting something, then paint is a resource I'm using on this, right? But we'll try and keep it there for now. And we can answer questions relating to all this and get into it more as we open up this conversation. But we just want to be able to identify those different variables where we can make changes so that things become easier and more sustainable, as opposed to people become more willing to push through very difficult things, pay very high costs.
We have a question in the chat, Brandon, and the question is, with this in mind, would you say that executive functioning is a medical diagnosis? Is it something that can be classified?
Well, there are diagnoses for executive dysfunction disorder, as well as specific learning disabilities and things like that can play into these kinds of things. With diagnosis, well, first of all, I'm not a doctor, so I don't speak to medical diagnosis, but as far as mental health and neurodevelopmental disorders, those kinds of things that are in the DSM, which I say as though everybody knows it, but that's the kind of codified book where it lists major depressive disorder, and here are the criteria to determine whether or not somebody is experiencing that. So for a lot of this stuff, they're diagnosed symptomatically rather than, I'm just using all kinds of jargon today, rather than etiologically. Etiologically meaning, knowing the root cause of. So as opposed to, for example, diabetes, where I can be diagnosed with that because we can measure insulin or blood sugar, or I honestly don't know, but something like that probably, right? And we can say you have diabetes, and we can make predictions about what will happen later on based on that information. These kinds of diagnoses are made by observing what somebody is doing and their subjective report of what they're experiencing. So in almost all of these diagnoses, because these things are universal experiences, if we were to consider them a binary, which they're obviously not. It's a spectrum of experiences. But everybody feels sad sometimes, right? That doesn't negate the legitimacy and validity of a depressive disorder diagnosis, because we're talking about the ways in which someone experiences that sadness, the frequency and the intensity and the duration of it. Same with executive functioning, ADHD, all these various different things, is that we're looking at what happens and making a diagnosis based off of that.
I think it's so interesting that you brought up the classic example that most teachers and parents are guilty of using, of if you don't get good grades, then you won't get into a good college, and then you won't get a good job. Where did we become socialized, or how do we become socialized to manipulate value as a society, and then also put a moral judgment on when people aren't able to do the things?
That's a great question. So, and it's I'm thinking of it kind of in three parts. One specifically about grades, one about why we tend to manipulate value rather than cost, and one about why we tend to turn things into moral judgments. And really, all of it has to do with the same thing, which is simplicity versus complexity, that these things are finite, right? Our awareness is finite. So the brain does not spend these resources on anything unless it has a reason to do so. So we can say things like, for example, everybody assumes that their experience is universal until and unless they have reason to believe otherwise. So I was talking about sleep earlier today. Your experience of sleep, how you feel tiredness, and how you feel wakefulness and restfulness, you just assume that's the same for everybody until people start explaining things to you, and now you have an idea that it's different, and then you can start to think of it, right? So a big part of the reason that we end up looking at cost, or we end up looking at value more often than cost, A, it tends to be simpler, but B, we have this assumption that for another person to do a thing, it would cost them about what it would cost us. And that the value of a thing to another person should be the same thing that we think the value of it is. So when we see somebody not doing a thing that we would do if we were in their, circumstance, right? So let's make it, we're talking about grades and academics. Let's talk about an essay. Our student or our child is not doing an essay that they're supposed to do. And we're sitting here saying, I know they're capable of doing it. They're a great writer. I don't understand. They're just not getting themselves going. They just need to stop being distracted and get started and they'll be fine, right? Well, the difference in value is a lot easier to discuss than the difference in cost for the third part of your question, which is when something is really complex, we want to make it simple, right? That's a bad way of putting it. Let me try it this way. Everything about being human is infinitely complex. You could pick any one aspect of it and dedicate your entire life to understanding it, and you will never have all the complexity. So we have to simplify things. We get into the complexity just enough to make it work, and then we stop. So if someone, for example, is struggling to get things done, then we might say, oh, make a list, which is simple advice. It's common advice. And we do that because it works for most people most of the time in most contexts. And if it does not work for a person, then we need to get more into the complexity. But if making a list works for me, I never got more into the complexity of this issue than that, because that's all I needed to know to make it work. And now I'm giving it to you and you're telling me it's not working and I don't understand why, because I don't know that complexity, that nuance. So then instead of dealing with the complexity, I simplify it into something moral, character-based, personality-based, that, oh, you're just lazy. I would do it and you're not doing it and I don't understand why. So it must be some indefinable quality native to you that is different from me. So you're lazy and I'm not, and that's why it's different. Because again, the brain, when it sees something that it doesn't like, it has to come up with a solution to that potential problem, right? If I see somebody else, I don't know why this is the example that popped in my head, but if I see somebody else, I hear about somebody else who's died in a car crash, then my brain is immediately gonna be like, okay, I'm in cars all the time. What's going on? Okay, what do I need to be aware of? I don't want to die. And then I find out that they were drunk driving. Then my brain can say, oh, great, I don't drive drunk, so I'm good. I don't need to worry about that. I don't need to spend my resources thinking about that anymore. I've solved it. So we need to kind of create this distance. And really, it often comes from a place of deep care, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but especially when we're talking about, children, as parents or as educators, we care about them. Watching them struggle and suffer and be in pain is awful. And so we try to help and we do everything that we can. And when it doesn't work, we try another thing. And when that doesn't work, we try another thing. But sooner or later, we run out of ideas of what to try. And at that point, what do? Oftentimes we say, well, it's not on me. I've tried everything. It's something that they need to do for themselves. They just need to choose or feel differently than they do because I've done everything I can do. Not always. Sometimes we get into finding other people who know more and experts, and that's the point of all that. But it's a lot simpler to go that way than to try to learn the complexity of another. I have spent my entire life and will spend my life until I die trying to understand just myself, and I won't do it. I won't get a perfect understanding of it. And each of us is doing the same thing. So I really can't understand you. You're not even understanding the full complexity of yourself. So we got to simplify these things. And as far as grades, we might talk about this sometime in the future, but there are certain things that I call markers, which is that they are not the goal themselves. Nobody actually cares about that. Grades is one of them. Money is one like that. Weight is often a marker, where the actual goal, the actual intention or desire is, I want to have this or experience this. And then I work backwards. I analyze and say, what's going to make it most likely or easiest for me to have that or experience that? Oh, money or good grades or whatever. Right? I don't actually care about my grades. I care about my future happiness. I don't care about my child or my students' grades. I care about their happiness. But I know that grades have a correlation there, or at least I believe they do. So I'm looking at grades as part of how I'm making predictions about will you be happy and successful later, even though I don't care about the grade.
So we have somebody in the chat asking for clarification. How do we help somebody with cost and manipulating cost and getting a task done? And quite frankly, sometimes we tell ourselves, well, what if they become overly dependent on me and I'm not going to always be there to help them? So can you chime in on that, Brandon?
Yeah, again, two really good questions, and I'll probably answer them all out of order, just like I did that last one. All right, you're gonna have to remind me. We don't want them to become too dependent, and how do we help them with cost? Those are the two things. Okay. So there are a lot of ways to help with cost, and to get into that, you have to get into the specifics of the given individual and the given task and the given context. So as a general, a way of looking at these things, what we do at Effective Artistry, we break it into three categories. That you can make changes in the self, you can make changes in the environment, or you can make changes in the way the self and the environment interact. And again, people tend to gravitate towards the self. I need to be better. I need to learn how to X, Y, or Z, right? And just like cost and value, it's not that one is better than the other. They're just different avenues. Generally, making changes in the self is something that takes a lot of time and energy and effort over time. If we take these kinds of things, these executive functioning things out of this context and use an example like sports, which I like to do because it shows the ridiculousness of how we tend to look at these things, where if someone is playing tennis for the first time or the 10th time or whatever, and they're terrible at it, they can't get to the ball. When they hit it, it goes over the fence or whatever, right? We don't tend to think like, well, okay, try again tomorrow. And if you really focus and you really care and you really try, you'll be really good. We know in those contexts kind of more intuitively that this is something that you have to develop over time, repetition, right? We talk about muscle memory, but the brain is the same way, that neural pathways in the brain get reinforced every time we do a thing. Every time you do a thing, it becomes easier to do on a biological level the next time. That neural pathway becomes easier to activate. And over time, some of these become the easiest in any given circumstance, any given response to any given stimuli, right? That's what we call habits, or, my default response, or the true self, or whatever, right? But those things can change. It just takes time. It's a very nice change to make because that sticks with you. You don't really lose those skills over time. There are exceptions to this. Obviously, there's deterioration and injury and things, but generally speaking, there's a reason that there's the phrase, it's like learning to ride a bike, right? That things that are really deeply learned tend not to be lost. So that's one way, but it's a long way. And when you got to make changes fast, it's almost never going to help. So this is where we get into that bad cycle of like, I just got to get myself to do it, as though there's some internal change we can make in a short time. And we can change the value for ourselves. In particular, the more we beat ourselves up, the worse we feel, the more stress, the more anxiety, whatever you want to call it, we feel about a thing. That changes the impact, because now if I do the thing, I can stop feeling this too. But it turns into a cycle. We beat ourselves up till we feel so bad, or we're so stressed because the deadline's there. So then we get it done. But then the next time, same cost and value equation, same accomplishment equation, right? So we do the same thing, go through all that stress and beat ourselves up again until it gets to the point where the value is high enough. As people from the outside, we can help develop skill, right? We can help people to learn changes in the self by teaching, by fostering, by creating environments that make that easy and enjoyable and rewarding. But in particular, we can do a lot more in those other two areas, where we change the environment, or we change the way in which the person and the environment are interacting with each other. And part of that is, again, like I was saying earlier, in setting the right goals. The number of clients that I have who are brilliant, but struggle with executive functioning, but were propped up, and this will get into the dependency thing, by all kinds of support through high school so that they could get into a great college, and then they go to the great college and then they fall apart, and then they take a medical withdrawal or end up in the hospital. And then I start working with them, after they've had a disastrous crisis, life-changing kind of first semester. Well, you know, there's a lot of things that could have been changed there, but a lot of times it was the wrong goal. Why are we trying so hard to get somebody into the most prestigious school, for example? Sometimes there are reasons for that, depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. But remember, we don't want to do anything unless there's a reason for it. And if we don't know the reason that we're going to try to get into Harvard, other than that everybody around us says it's a good idea, but once we get there, well, we've already gotten that reward. Everybody's so happy that we got into Harvard, but now we're doing this incredibly difficult thing. And I'm looking around and realizing that there's nothing here that I wanted, or at least nothing here that I couldn't have gotten at an easier school to get into. It becomes very difficult to do that because the value isn't that high anymore. So we want to choose the right goals. It really starts with knowing what you want. I got another little pithy thing someday: desire, design, deliver. You got to know what you want, then make a plan, then execute. And if you're struggling with execution, sometimes it's because of the plan. If you're struggling with the plan, sometimes it's because of not knowing what you want or not choosing the right thing. So we can help in that sense. We can also help in the sense of manipulating the actual physical environment, not just what somebody's going for, but changing things, right? That if somebody has an auditory sensitivity and we create a space or give them access to a space that has less auditory, less noise in it, then it's going to be easier for them. The cost will come down on being able to accomplish whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, because their resources won't have to be spent on managing or filtering out that noise to the same level. And interactions is really what most people think of when they think of executive functioning. It's routines and habits and strategies. The way that you take notes, that's an interaction. There's the information being presented to you. How you go about trying to record and remember that information is how you're interacting with it. How you manage your schedule and your planner, the routines you set for yourself in the morning or in the evening, is the interaction. So we can look at all those things and start to make changes. And of course, we always want to be empirical, right? We come up with our best idea of what will help. We try it, we see what happens. If it helps, great. If it doesn't, great, we know more, but we're throwing it away and going with something else instead of just trying to keep doing the same thing. That was how to manage costs. What was the other part of the question?
The other part is, we as parents eventually want our kids to be independent and fly the coop, right? And the idea of overly dependent children or establishing that independence is really important. And if we give them all the supports up front, are they going to become overly dependent on those things?
So I want to reference Bean Dad here, but I feel like that's a very timely reference that will be very dated. Probably already is. Here's the problem with that conceptualization, is that people learn by being assisted. People learn, Mike, you could probably talk to this more than I can, that there, depending on what model you're looking at of teaching, that a common way of talking about it is, first, we want the person to see someone else doing or talking about whatever it is that we're trying to get them to learn. Then we have the two people do it together. Then we have the learner do it independently, right? That's the transition. So if we try to force that transition when it's not happening naturally, we're undercutting everything. In other words, that idea that I am creating dependence, that I'm being a helicopter parent, that I'm enabling all these, and by the way, I have a whole rant that I won't get into on why it's these kinds of things that bleed into the popular culture, these psychological concepts that happen to justify not helping people, that become so popular, as opposed to other ones that might ask more of people. But what we're doing, what that's based on, is that we are making an assessment from the outside that they shouldn't need the help that we are giving them anymore. That they're only utilizing the help because we're offering it, and that if we didn't offer it, they would be fine on their own. But the inherent problem there is, you're saying, if I stop giving them help now, maybe that will help, because I'm worried that if I help them now but stop giving them help later, that will be a problem. And in what context I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but just in what context does that make sense, that if I support them and help them for a longer period of time before withdrawing the support is going to have a worse outcome than withdrawing the support now, without whatever they learn and develop in that intervening time? that we are, in terms of the accomplishment equation, support brings down the cost. That's a positive context factor, that people helping you, people doing parts of it for you or assisting you in doing parts of the task makes it easier. And, you know, why not make it easier? Scaffold, right?
Well, Brandon, you and I had talked earlier in an earlier conversation about what it means to be an adult. And do you mind talking a little bit about that, of the misconception of what it means to be an adult?
Yeah, that's one of those fun, like, semantic terms. Every time I have a client that's turning 18, we have like a whole several sessions where they're like, oh gosh, I'm 18, I don't feel like an adult. Because it's one of those arbitrary, you know, terms. It means all different kinds of things. The way that I like to think of being an adult is, as a child, you have no control. You know, as a baby, right? You do nothing, you're making no decisions, you're responding to stimuli. And as you get older and your brain develops and you learn more, you take on more and more and more of that control. And remember that all these things, by the way, talking about the dependence part too, to say that someone who's 15 years old doesn't need help tying their shoe, well, that might be true in most cases, but it is not true in all cases, right? So treating someone as though their unique needs or supports or whatever should not be given to them because they should be in a different place than they are is problematic. But what I call being an adult is when I have taken over control of assessing what it is I'm trying to do and how I'm going about doing it, and taking over getting support for myself. Not that I no longer need support, but that I'm now the one saying, I need support and I'm going to go ask for it, rather than the other people, the adults in my life, just giving the support whether I want it or not. And a lot of the conflict that I see, especially with parents and teenage children or college student children, is when parents see their kids struggling and we want to help. We don't want them to be in pain. So we offer this support, but they have a different idea of how things are going to go than we do. And the older and more knowledgeable and more experienced you become, the harder it is for me to supplant your beliefs about what's going to happen with mine. You know, I have a 4-year-old. If I tell him something's different than he thinks it is, he'll be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, because you know more about stuff than me. If I do that with a 17-year-old, they'll be like, no, you're wrong, I'm right. So to me, the process of becoming an adult, which is not binary and never done, is about getting to the point where I'm going for the support that I want and need, as opposed to having it offered to me without me asking.
Thanks. You know, we got a great question in the chat, bringing us back to the original topic. You know, the question asks, if a kid doesn't see the value in doing the thing or doing something, how does changing cost even matter in the long run?
That's a good question. Well, so seeing value, that's one of those phrases that frames it as a binary when it's not. That there's really almost nothing that I'm going to see zero value in at all, especially if it's something that you, as the parent or the educator or whomever, see value in. It's going to have an impact, right? So I might subjectively not care about that impact as much as you, but there's still usually something there. So what we're talking about is they value it, but they don't value it enough for it to be worth the cost. So by bringing the cost down, we can still get it under that threshold. But the exchange is, if they don't value, or if they value something very low, you know, they think something is relatively unimportant, even though it has value, not much, then yeah, we better make it pretty cheap for them to do it, I should say, not want to do it. Otherwise, we've got to arbitrarily increase the value. And I'm trying to be clear, but I'm probably not as clear as I want to be about the fact that that is not a bad thing. They're different things. We have to manipulate, as parents, as educators, as adults, our job is to help people by manipulating the value, because they don't have the context or the knowledge or whatever in many cases to understand. When my son goes to run into the street because a ball ran into the street and he wants to get the ball, he's not thinking about traffic and danger the way that I am. And so it's not about bringing the cost down for him in that moment. I'm going to yell stop and make that value shoot through the roof of stopping, because dad yelled at me and dad doesn't yell. So it must be important, I'm going to freeze, right? So you're right that changing the cost won't solve the problem on its own if there's absolutely zero value there. If they really think there is zero value in a thing, That's usually not the case. Usually they mean that there's little value. Although, although even in that case, if we're going to get them to do it, we're going to have to increase the value. And the more we bring that cost down, the less we have to do to increase the value to make it work. Not to mention that there's generalization, that making this thing easier may also make other related things easier that might be considered valuable later, right?
And at what point, I mean, I guess it depends on whatever it is. Obviously, your example of stopping your kid from running into the streets, pretty immediate, but at what point as parents and educators we just say, okay, well, we'll have it your way, let them fail and see how it goes?
Yeah, that question, I get that question a lot too, and it's really related to that kind of dependence thing. And it's that same kind of psychological concept that people need to experience the negative consequences of their behavior in order to see the value in it changing. So that can happen if their belief, if their impact, right, if what they believe will change if they do or don't do a thing is off. If they are not aware of the consequences of doing things that they're doing or not doing or whatever, right, then letting them experience those things will clarify for them, oh, this is what it's like. Yeah, that's way more valuable than I thought it was. Now I know. The problem is when there are things that people know how bad it is, they already think it's valuable. If we put them in that position then to say, okay, now go and experience this failure that you're already fearing, that you're already dreading, this is not valuable. That's not going to make you better or more easily able to do the thing in the future. And you already value it. So really, we're just exposing you to a terrible, miserable experience. So, as an exaggerated version of this, although true, a real thing that I see all the time, that I, as a teacher, give an assignment of doing a one-page essay, and it's worth X amount of points towards your final grade, because that's how I judge, the value of this thing in the scope of our curriculum, right? Well, for most students, maybe I judge that it will take them about a half an hour to an hour to write a one-page essay. It's 300 words, it's not a big deal, so I don't put a lot of points on it. Well, then students are going to go away and let's assume that all the students know exactly and agree exactly on how valuable this thing is. They know the points, they know how that works into the grade and what grades are valuable for and blah, blah, blah. Well, if one student can write it in 30 minutes to an hour, then they very well may, right? That cost is low enough for the value. Another student who values it just as much, but for whatever reason, let's say they're dyslexic, for example, or they just don't know how to write very well, or have a language processing issue, or didn't understand the assignment. Well, for them, in order to get this done, it's going to cost them 8 hours, and they'll have a panic attack and an emotional meltdown along the way. Well, then all of a sudden it's really not worth doing, even though I agree with the other kid on exactly how valuable it is. So if I step back then and let that child experience that failure, that if it changes the value, it changes it through trauma. It changes it because that experience was so awful that they will then value getting away from it. But the problem with that too is that I talk about positive goals and negative goals, and I see our time is wrapping up, and I know I bring up a million concepts, but negative goals meaning I want to go for the absence of something, whereas positive goals are I want to go for the presence of something, an increase in something. So if that experience of writing that essay is just absolutely miserable for me, well, the value for me now is not in writing an essay, it's in never going through that experience again. So now my behavior is going to shift, because if I can't write that essay for whatever reason without, I'm going to spend a lot of my resources doing whatever else I have to do to get out of doing the essay, changing how I feel about it, convincing everybody else around me that I don't need to do it, or just lying about the fact that I've done it, or whatever, because I just need to not experience that anymore. I'm a parent myself, and I'm with everybody. We don't want our kids to need us forever. The problem is that as parents, as educators, our job is to project into the future. We know we only get so much time with these children in order to help them grow and develop skills and shape the way they see the world and whatever, right? So at all times, before you're even pregnant in many cases, you're thinking about, how does this affect the baby? How does this affect the child? How does this affect the teen in terms of, will they be happy? Will they be successful? Will they be independent, or whatever it is that you're defining as those goals, right? That's our job. But when we lose track, when we get out of balance and over focus on those projections and lose track of what's happening in the moment, we end up getting, our decisions are less than optimal, right? As an example, my older son, who's now 4, is a very kind of passive, sweet, loving, he's not a conflict, he's very conflict avoidant. And when he was 2 and one of his cousins would just take a toy out of his hand, and he would just turn and grab another toy and just keep playing because he wouldn't care, right? Well, that's good. I like that. I didn't want him to fight or cry or push back or whatever. But when other adults look at that and say, uh-oh, he's going to get walked over when he's later, when he's older, people are going to be able to push him around. That's a projection into the future. And if I let that dictate what I'm doing now, and so I start teaching him to punch people or fight back or whatever, right? I'm now encouraging him to do something that I don't actually like, because I think that it might contribute to something else that I'm worried might happen later. And I wish I had a perfect answer for this, for like how to know and decide like when it's worth it and when it's not. And we don't. We all just have to make our best guesses, use the information that we have. Getting more information helps, talking to people helps, but try not to overvalue potential futures as opposed to present realities. When you're, again, I see parents and students and teachers and whatever go through these situations where the kid is miserable, depressed, suicidal, right? People who drop out of colleges, fail out of colleges. And every step along the way, that doesn't come out of nowhere. That's misery building up over a long, long, long time in most cases. And everybody is aware because everybody cares and everyone's paying attention. We all know it's going bad, but we're trying to do different things to fix it that contribute to it just continuing to go, instead of anybody taking a step back and saying, okay, is it best for you to keep going down this path right now when you're about to end up in the hospital, because we think it's valuable to your future career and financial success and independence, which are all good things. I'm not trying to downplay that. But if we're sacrificing too much in the present for that future, we're just out of balance. Same the other way. If I let a kid do whatever they want all the time and never think about the future and take that into account, then that's out of balance too. So we just got to keep trying to calibrate.
Well, Brandon, that wraps up our hour together. I want to thank all the guests for joining us this week. If you're interested, I invite you to join us next week when we'll dig into motivation. Brandon, thank you so much for your time tonight, and I feel like we've learned a lot about the accomplishment equation. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Mike.
Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, we are no